The glass didn't break when it hit the floor. That was the thing Waverley kept coming back to afterward, in the hospital, in the police interviews, in the long, quiet hours of a life she hadn't expected to survive. The wine glass should have shattered. Instead, it bounced once on the marble floor of the Aldertons' grand ballroom and rolled under a chair, intact, still holding the 2 inches of Barolo that Waverley had poured 12 seconds before she knocked it out of the man's hand. 12 seconds. That's all the time there was between a normal Tuesday evening and the rest of her life. She'd been working the Alderton Hotel for 9 months by then. Long enough to know which guests tipped well and which ones looked through her like she was furniture. Long enough to memorize the service elevator codes and the names of the florist who came every Monday. And the particular way head steward, Gerald Hutchins, pursed his lips when he was about to criticize something. She was good at her job. She was good at most things she put her mind to, which was how she'd gotten through 3 years of nursing school on a combination of scholarships and back-to-back catering shifts before her younger brother Eli's accident had rearranged everything. The Alderton sat on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, 52 floors of limestone and glass that catered to the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The grand ballroom on the 4th floor hosted galas and private dinners and the occasional corporate event where men in $12,000 suits discussed things Waverley had no interest in understanding. Her job was to keep the glasses full and the plates cleared and the service invisible. She was extraordinarily good at invisible. The private dinner that Tuesday was for 8 guests, and Waverley had been briefed on exactly 2 things before her shift. Keep the 2019 Barolo breathing, and the client preferred not to have staff hovering. She'd been given the name on the reservation. Caruso, and told that Gerald himself had cleared the seating chart, which meant whoever this was mattered in ways that didn't get explained to temporary catering staff. She got her first look at Franklin Caruso when she brought the initial bread service at 7:15. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more interesting with age, harder, more considered. He sat at the head of the table with the ease of someone who had never once wondered if he belonged somewhere. The men flanking him were younger, attentive in a way that Waverley had come to recognize as professional rather than social. Not friends, associates. 2 of them wore their jackets in the particular stiff way that meant they were carrying something underneath. She'd noted all of this without meaning to, filed it away with the same quiet efficiency that made her good at the job, and gone back to the service station to check the temperature on the soup course. By 8:30 the dinner had progressed through 3 courses, and Waverley had fallen into the rhythm of it, the particular invisible choreography of upscale service where you anticipated needs without being asked and vanished the moment you weren't needed. She was refilling water glasses along the far side of the table when she noticed the man who'd come in late. He hadn't been on the original guest list. She knew, because Gerald had made her memorize it. He'd been shown to the table by someone she didn't recognize, a small man with a pale, damp face who'd appeared at the ballroom's side entrance and gestured the newcomer inside before disappearing again. The late arrival had taken a seat 2 chairs from Franklin Caruso, accepted a glass of wine from the server on the opposite side, and begun the very convincing performance of someone engaged in pleasant dinner conversation. Waverley was good at reading rooms. It was a survival skill she'd developed early, growing up in a house where the weather changed without warning, where you learned to read your father's posture from across the room before you got close enough to feel the shift in his mood. She couldn't have articulated what bothered her about the late arrival. He was well-dressed, well-spoken from the fragments she caught, and physically unremarkable. But something in the way he watched Franklin Caruso, too steady, too patient, the way a person watches something they've been waiting a very long time to see, made the back of her neck prickle. She moved toward the service station, meaning to say something to Gerald, though she wasn't sure what she'd say. "I have a feeling" wasn't a sentence that went over well with Gerald Hutchins. She'd almost reached the door when she turned back, some instinct she didn't have a name for, and saw the late arrival reach into his jacket. The movement was small, careful. The kind of movement designed not to be noticed. Waverley didn't think. Later she would try to reconstruct the thought process and find nothing there. No calculation, no courage, just the same reflex that had made her grab Eli's arm when he'd stepped off a curb without looking at 17 years old, the same muscle memory of someone who had spent her whole life watching for the moment before the moment. She crossed the distance to the table in 4 steps and knocked the wine glass from his hand. The glass bounced. The wine spread across the white tablecloth in a dark bloom. The man's hand moved differently without the cover of reaching for something, and in the fraction of a second before the room registered what was happening, Waverley grabbed his wrist with both hands and pulled it up and away from the table with everything she had. The sound was small, a click, and then a sharp crack that she felt in her sternum before she heard it, and then the ballroom dissolved into screaming. She was on the floor. She wasn't sure when she'd gotten there. The chandelier above her was very bright and someone was saying her name, though she didn't know how they knew it. Waverley. Waverley, stay with me. She turned her head and found Franklin Caruso kneeling beside her, his silver hair disheveled for the first time. His expression cracked open in a way that didn't match the composed, controlled face she'd observed all evening. "I'm fine," she said. Because that was what she always said, he told her, and the steadiness in his voice was the thing that finally made her look down at herself, her left side. Something warm. "Oh," she said quietly, and then the ceiling tilted, and everything went white. The hospital was Northwest Memorial, 12 minutes from the Alderton by ambulance. The bullet had entered through her left side and clipped a rib before exiting cleanly, and the surgeon who explained this to her used words like fortunate and remarkable, and another 2 inches in ways that made her feel like she'd won something she hadn't entered a competition for. She lay in a room that was too bright and tried to remember if she'd turned off the stove at home. She hadn't cooked that morning. She'd been too rushed, had grabbed a granola bar and sprinted for the train. Still, the thought occupied her mind with strange insistence while the nurses changed her IV line and a detective named Ray Oakes sat in the chair beside her bed with a notepad on his knee. "Walk me through it again," he said. He had grey-blue eyes and the careful patience of someone who understood that people needed to tell their stories at their own pace. She told him. The late arrival, the too steady watching, the small careful movement of the hand. She told him about the reflex, about not thinking, about the wine glass that hadn't broken. "You disarmed him," Oak said. "I knocked the glass into his arm. It wasn't. I wasn't trying." Cross. He leaned forward slightly. "You redirected a man who was about to fire a weapon at a seated target in a crowded room. Whether or not you planned it, that's what happened." Waverley stared at the ceiling tiles. "Is he? Did anyone or injuries? The shot went into the floor. The subject is in custody." Oakes paused. "Cross, do you know who Franklin Caruso is?" She'd looked him up in the ambulance, on her phone with shaking hands, because she'd known from the moment she saw those jackets that he wasn't simply a wealthy man with a restaurant reservation. The search results had been illuminating and not particularly comforting. "He's in construction," she said carefully. "Real estate. Port logistics." Oakes looked at her with the expression of someone deciding how honest to be. "He's also someone with significant interests in certain industries that operate outside conventional legal frameworks. He's been a subject of federal investigation on 3 separate occasions, never charged." A pause that did a lot of work. "The man who tried to shoot him tonight has ties to a rival organization. This wasn't opportunistic. It was planned." The warm feeling in her side had settled into a dull, constant ache. "So when you say rival organization, I mean that the people who planned tonight's attempt aren't going to be pleased that it failed. And they're going to know why it failed." He held her gaze steadily. "Your name will be in a police report within the hour, Miss Cross. I can't stop that." Waverley looked at the window. Outside, Chicago's lights made a wash of amber and white against the dark November sky. "My brother?" she said. "I'm sorry, my brother Eli. He lives with me. He has a traumatic brain injury from a car accident 2 years ago. He needs daily care." She stopped, measuring her words. "If I'm in some kind of danger, if people are going to come looking for me, he can't be there." Something shifted in Oakes's expression. Not pity, exactly. Recognition, maybe. Is there somewhere safe he could go temporarily? She thought of their aunt in Rockford, their mother's sitter, who had a house with a fenced yard and a spare room and no idea that her niece had just spent an evening getting shot in a hotel ballroom. "Yes, then I'd suggest arranging that soon." Oakes stood, leaving a business card on the bedside table. "Mr. Caruso has indicated he'd like to speak with you before he leaves the hospital tonight. I told him that was your decision." He glanced at the door. "For what it's worth, I've been working in this city for 22 years. Franklin Caruso pays his debts. Whatever that means to you." He left, and Waverley lay in the quiet that followed, listening to the monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital, and thought about Eli's face that morning over breakfast, the particular careful concentration with which he'd poured his own orange juice since the accident, proud of each small thing he'd reclaimed. She picked up her phone and called their aunt. Franklin Caruso came to her room at 10:45 in a fresh shirt, which struck her as an odd detail to notice, but she noticed it. He'd clearly gone somewhere to change. He stood in the doorway until she nodded, then took the same chair Detective Oakes had occupied, and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "I've been in rooms with dangerous people my entire adult life," he said finally. I've had security detail for 15 years. 3 attempts before tonight, 2 of which my people stopped before they got anywhere near a ballroom. He laced his fingers together and rested his elbows on his knees. Tonight, the person who stopped it was a hotel server who had no reason to put herself in the way. I wasn't thinking about reasons, Waverly said. I know. That's what I can't get out of my head. He studied her. You could have walked to that door and done nothing, and no one would have blamed you. What made you turn around? She thought about it honestly. The way he was watching you, it was too patient, like he'd been waiting. Caruso nodded slowly. Most people don't notice things like that. I grew up noticing things like that, she said, and left the reasons for that behind the sentence, where they belonged. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Mims, Cross, what Oakes told you about the men who planned this? He was being careful, as police have to be. I'll be more direct. The organization that sent that man will see your interference as a problem they need to address. They don't forgive disruption to their plans. They will find out your name, if they don't already have it. He told me something like that. I'd like to offer you protection. My security team is experienced and discreet. Until this situation is resolved, I'd feel considerably better knowing you were somewhere safe. He paused. I also understand that you have a brother who requires care, and that your current employment situation will likely change in the next 48 hours for reasons that have nothing to do with your performance. Waverly looked at him steadily. You know about Eli. I make it my business to understand situations I'm responsible for. His voice was even, matter of fact, not apologetic. I'm not going to pretend I operate like other people. But I will tell you that I don't make offers I don't intend to keep, and I don't forget what people do for me. She should have felt invaded. Some part of her did, but a larger part of her was running the math with the same practical efficiency that had gotten her through every hard thing in her life, and the math was stark. She was injured, would lose her job, was apparently now a problem to be solved by people with resources she couldn't imagine. And the only person she needed to protect couldn't protect himself. My brother's safety is the condition, she said. If anything happened to Eli because of this, no arrangement you offered would matter. Something moved in Caruso's expression, respect, maybe, or recognition. His safety is already being arranged. I took the liberty of assigning a team to watch his building tonight, temporarily and without his knowledge, until a better situation can be organized. He met her gaze. I should have asked first. Yes, she agreed. But thank you. He nodded once. There's a property in Lake Geneva. My daughter keeps it as a main residence, but she's abroad until February. Secure, comfortable, staffed. You'd have your own space, privacy, and my head of security will be in contact first thing tomorrow. He stood. My daughter's name is Renata. She's already aware of the situation and insists, rather forcefully, that the house be made available. The corner of his mouth moved. She's more persuasive than I am, frankly. Waverly thought later that the thing she remembered most from that conversation was not the offer or the fear or the very real possibility that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. It was the way Franklin Caruso had said his daughter's name, with that involuntary warmth that people couldn't manufacture, that existed entirely outside their control. A man with warmth he couldn't hide was a man she could trust at least a little, at least enough. Okay, she said. I'll need to explain something to my brother that won't frighten him. We'll help you figure out what to say. His head of security was a woman named Danny Orvik, and Waverly liked her immediately and completely despite every reason not to. She arrived at the hospital the next morning in dark clothes, with the posture of someone who had decided long ago that the world was best approached as a series of problems to be solved. She was perhaps 45, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that catalogued everything in a room within seconds of entering it. I've read your file, she said by way of introduction. I don't have a file, Waverly said. You do now. She sat in the chair, crossed her ankles, and looked at Waverly with the frank appraisal of someone who didn't have time for social conventions. Nursing school, 2 years. Top of your cohort before you withdrew. 3 years in catering and hospitality after that. Your brother's accident. The medical bills. A pause. You've been handling impossible situations for a long time. That's one way to put it. I say it because it's relevant. People who've been managing crises tend to do better in situations like this than people who haven't. Danny leaned forward slightly. What I need from you is honesty and the willingness to follow protocols you might find overly cautious. What I'll give you in return is transparency about what we know and what we don't, and my personal guarantee that your brother will not be at risk while you're under our protection. Waverly studied her. What do you know? The man from last night is named Stefan Varos. He works for an organization run by a man named Cole Rieger, who runs operations in 3 cities and has a particular animosity toward Franklin Caruso that goes back about 8 years, and a real estate dispute that cost Riga more than he's ever publicly acknowledged. Danny's voice was clipped, efficient. Riga's people are already aware that their attempt failed. They don't know yet why or how, but they'll find out. Once they do, they'll want to make an example, because allowing an unarmed hotel server to disrupt their operation without consequences makes them look incompetent. That's incredibly motivating to hear, Waverly said dryly. Danny's mouth twitched. Just barely. I appreciate the sarcasm. It means you're not in shock. She stood. We move you to Lake Geneva this afternoon. Your brother goes to your aunt in Rockford this morning. We'll provide a driver and an escort quietly. We've already arranged for his regular care providers to make home visits in Rockford for the duration. Waverly felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. You already arranged that. Mr. Caruso was very clear about priorities. She looked out the window. The lake was visible from this room, grey-green and enormous, indifferent to everything happening on its shore. What do I tell Eli? Danny considered. The truth in broad strokes. You helped someone important, and you need to stay somewhere else for a few weeks while the situation settles, and he's going to stay with Aunt Lynn because you want him somewhere comfortable and familiar. Children and people in Eli's situation generally accept the emotional truth of a situation, even when the specifics are simplified. He'll know you're protecting him. He won't ask for details you're not giving. Waverly thought of Eli's face that morning, of his careful concentration over orange juice. He was 24 years old and had been, before the accident, sharp and funny and planning to become a civil engineer. He was still sharp, sometimes. Still funny, but the accident had changed the architecture of things, and she had spent 2 years learning to love the new version of her brother while grieving the future he'd lost. He's going to be okay, Danny said, not unkindly. I'll make sure of it personally. Waverly nodded, trusting the sentence more than she expected to. The Lake Geneva house was set back from the water down a private drive that wound through birch trees, still holding their last yellow leaves. It was large without being excessive. A low modern structure with clean lines and walls of glass overlooking the lake, the kind of architecture that understood its landscape instead of competing with it. Waverly stood on the front steps with her bag over her good shoulder and felt, for the first time in days, a fraction of something that wasn't fear or pain. Renata Caruso was waiting inside. She was not what Waverly had expected, though she realized she hadn't constructed a specific expectation. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back from a face that shared her father's bone structure, but wore it differently, more open, quicker to move. She'd apparently cut her trip short by 2 weeks, a detail Danny had mentioned in a tone that suggested this was extremely typical behavior. I'm Renata, she said, extending her hand, and her grip was firm and direct. I want you to know that I suggested this to my father before he even finished explaining what had happened. Please don't feel like you're being housed somewhere as an afterthought. I don't, Waverly said honestly. Renata looked at her for a moment with frank appraisal. Good. Come in. I'll show you your rooms and then we'll eat something because you've been in a hospital for 18 hours. And hospital food is an insult to everyone involved. The weeks at Lake Geneva developed their own quiet rhythm. Waverly worked on the 2 online courses she'd enrolled in before the incident, trying to finish the prerequisites that would let her re-enter nursing school in the spring. She called Eli every morning at 9, which was when he had breakfast at Aunt Lynn's, and she could hear the particular satisfaction in his voice when he reported that he'd made his own coffee 2 days in a row. Danny sent her brief, factual updates every evening. The Riga organization was trying to locate her. They hadn't yet. She saw Franklin Caruso on the 3rd weekend. He arrived on a Saturday morning without announcement, driving himself, which seemed to surprise the security team more than it surprised Waverly. He found her in the sunroom with a textbook and a cup of coffee and knocked on the open door before entering. Renata said, "You've been working on nursing school prerequisites," he said. I had to stop when everything with Eli started. I'm trying to get back. She set down her coffee. She tells you things. She tells me everything. I'm her father. He took the chair across from her with the same ease she'd noticed at the hotel, someone completely unself-conscious about his right to occupy any space. How's the side better? It pulls when I reach for things. He nodded. They sat in the particular quiet of 2 people who had been through something extreme together and had not yet found the language for it. I owe you something I don't know how to quantify, he said. You don't owe me anything, I reacted. It wasn't. It was, he said, with a quiet firmness that closed the argument gently. I've spent my life in a world where I understand how debts work. This one is significant. I'd like you to let me help with nursing school. Tuition, cost of living while you're studying, proper support for Eli's care so that it doesn't fall entirely on you. Waverley looked at him steadily. That's a lot. It's commensurate. It's also the kind of thing that creates complications, obligations. He leaned forward slightly. Miss Cross, I'm 61 years old and I've made a considerable number of mistakes in my life. One of the things I've learned is that there are two kinds of debts. The kind you pay so that you no longer owe anything, and the kind you pay because the person is worth being connected to. He paused. I'm not interested in creating obligations. I'm interested in not watching someone who saved my life struggle with things that are within my power to change. She thought about that. Outside, the lake was flat and silver, holding the late autumn light. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. That's enough for now. They ended up talking for 3 hours. She learned that he'd started in construction at 22 with his father's borrowed tools, and the first building he'd ever worked on had been a housing project in Bridgeport that he still occasionally drove past just to see it standing. He told her about the years of building something that had accumulated, in the way these things sometimes did, other kinds of weight, alliances and favors, and the complex architecture of obligation that didn't appear on any legal document. He said this without apology and without the performance of remorse, which she found oddly trustworthy. He didn't seem to think she required his shame. He just told her the shape of things. She told him about Eli, about the accident, about the 2 years of recalibration that had followed. About the nursing degree she'd been 80% through before everything changed. About the specific loneliness of watching your plans reorganize themselves around someone else's need without being able to call it sacrifice. Because sacrifice was something you chose, and she hadn't chosen. She just responded, the same way she had in the ballroom. Without thinking, with everything she had. You do that a lot, he said. Move toward the thing instead of away from it. It usually works out, she said, and then they both laughed, and the laugh acknowledged her bullet wound and his near-death experience and the absurdity of all of it, and something shifted between them into something easier. 2 weeks later, Danny came to find Waverley in the kitchen, where she'd been learning to make her grandmother's apple cake with Renata, who turned out to cook with the same cheerful intensity she brought to everything. We have a problem, Danny said. The problem was this. A woman named Geneva Price, who had worked in Danny's security rotation for 4 years, had been passing information to Coleridge's people. She'd been doing it for 6 weeks, long enough that they knew Waverley was in Lake Geneva. Long enough that they knew the property layout. How much time, Caruso asked. He'd arrived 20 minutes after Danny's call, and now stood in the front room with Danny and 2 other members of the security team, his face composed in that particular stillness that Waverley recognized as a man containing a great deal of feeling behind professional control. They'll move tonight, probably. We have maybe 4 to 6 hours. Danny paused. We found Geneva trying to delete communication logs. She's in the East Wing. And my daughter. Renata is with 2 of our people in the interior room. She's fine. He nodded. Then he looked at Waverley, who was standing in the doorway, and something crossed his face that she hadn't seen there before. Open, undisguised worry. The kind that doesn't have anything to do with practicality. Waverley. He'd started using her first name sometime in the 3rd week, and she'd noticed but hadn't said anything. I need you to go with Danny to the safe room. Will you do that? What are you going to do? That could mean a lot of things. He met her gaze. No, I'm going to talk to Geneva first. Then I'm going to make some calls to people who have been waiting for an opportunity like this to propose a different arrangement with Riga's organization. He paused. I've been negotiating this for 3 weeks. This might be the thing that accelerates it. Or it might get complicated first. His voice was even. I've been in complicated situations before. Waverley looked at him for a long moment. He was 61 years old and had built something from borrowed tools, and somewhere along the way had accumulated a life that included enemies willing to fire weapons in hotel ballrooms. He was also someone who had spent 3 hours on a Saturday day telling her about a housing project in Bridgeport that he still drove past to see standing. Don't make decisions tonight that you'll have to live with differently tomorrow, she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode. You said something like that to me once before. I'm saying it again. Something moved behind his eyes. Then he nodded once and turned to Danny. Move them to the safe room. I'll be in contact every 30 minutes. The safe room was a reinforced space below the main house with a radio and enough supplies for 72 hours. Waverley sat with Renata, who was characteristically calm in the way people are when they've been managing their father's world for long enough to have developed genuine equanimity about it. He'll be all right, Renata said. He always is, but I think you already know that. I don't know him that well. You know him better than you think. He talks about that Saturday differently than I've heard him talk about anything in a long time. She looked at Waverley. He said you told him not to become someone he'd hate. Something like that. He needed someone to say that who wasn't me. Daughters don't count. We have too much invested. Renata pulled her knees to her chest. He's been trying to exit certain parts of the business for 3 years. Quietly. Slowly. Looking for a structure that doesn't collapse things people depend on. She paused. Cole Rieger has been the main obstacle. Rieger is old model, unwilling to move. But if Tanai accelerates things, the radio crackled. Danny's voice. We have the situation. Geneva is being dealt with. Mr. Caruso is on a call with the intermediary. Stand by. They stood by. An hour passed, and then another. The radio crackled again at 2 in the morning. It's over. Danny's voice carried the flat relief of someone who'd been wound tight for hours. Rieger's people agreed to stand down pending formal negotiations. Mr. Caruso will explain the D threat is resolved. Renata let out a long, slow breath. Waverly sat in the quiet of the fortified room and thought about 12 seconds. About a wine glass that hadn't broken. About all the ways a single unremarkable moment could become the hinge everything else turned on. Franklin Caruso came to the safe room himself to tell them it was clear. He looked tired in the way people look when they've spent hours in the particular exhaustion of high-stakes conversation, wrung out, but intact. He held the door open for them, and as Waverly passed him in the doorway, he said quietly, "Thank you for what you said. Did it help? Geneva is being given a choice similar to the one I suspect you predicted I'd give her." He met her eyes. "She's got family. It seemed relevant." Waverly nodded. It was. They stood in the hallway, both of them slightly too tired for the conversation they were probably going to have eventually, while Renata disappeared tactfully in the direction of the kitchen. "The negotiations with Rieger's organization will take some time," he said. "But the structure is in place. The intermediary has been working toward this for months, and tonight's incident gave everyone sufficient motivation to finalize." He leaned against the hallway wall in the posture of someone who had earned their exhaustion. "Which means, Waverly, that the direct threat to you will be neutralized within the next few weeks. You'll be able to go home." She thought about her apartment, about the particular sound the radiator made in November, about Eli's orange juice and the nursing school prerequisites, and the 1,000 specific details of a life that had been waiting intact for her to come back to it. "Good," she said, and meant it. He looked at her for a moment. "I'd like permission to remain in contact after, not as someone who owes you something, but as..." He paused, searching for the right word with the visible effort of a man who spent most of his time in rooms where precision of language had consequences. "As someone who would like to know how nursing school goes, how Eli does, how you are." Waverly considered him. A man who still drove past a housing project in Bridgeport. A man who'd given an informant a choice instead of a consequence, because she'd been in his hallway and asked him to remember who he wanted to be. "I'd like that," she said. The relief on his face was small and genuine and completely unguarded, and it was the thing she remembered most when she thought about that night afterward. 3 months later, Waverly Cross was back in a clinical rotation at Northwestern, which was not the hospital she'd expected to complete her degree in, but turned out to be exactly the right one. Her instructor was sharp and demanding and told her on the 3rd week that she had the best situational instinct she'd seen in a student in 15 years, which made Waverly laugh in a way she hadn't planned. Eli had moved back to their apartment. He'd started a twice-weekly program at a rehabilitation center that Franklin Caruso had quietly ensured had space for him, and he was learning, with great seriousness, to cook 3 things. The orange juice was a given. He'd moved on to eggs and experimentally pasta. She had coffee with Franklin Caruso on a Sunday in February, at a place near the hospital that he'd found and she'd never been to, and they talked for 2 hours about a housing project he was working on in Pilsen that used a financing model he'd developed specifically to avoid certain kinds of entanglement, and about the nursing unit management course she was taking in the spring, and about Eli's pasta, which had been, by all accounts, excellent. She walked back to the hospital in the cold February air afterward, and thought about what Detective Oakes had told her. Franklin Caruso pays his debts. He did. But what she'd come to understand, in the month since a wine glass had bounced on a marble floor and her life had swung on its hinge, was that he paid them in a particular way. Not with the transaction-minded efficiency of someone clearing a ledger, but with the steady, patient attention of someone who understood that the real currency wasn't money or protection or even safety. It was the willingness to show up, to keep showing up. To remember that the people worth being connected to are the ones who moved toward the thing instead of away from it, and to honor that in whatever way you could. The next Sunday, he brought Renata. The Sunday after that, Eli came too. Some things you don't choose. They choose you in the 12 seconds before you have time to think about it. What you get to choose afterward is everything else.